It began with a dream that seemed ordinary, even noble. A car for the people, affordable, dependable, simple enough for every worker to own. In the Germany of the early 1930s, that idea was almost unthinkable. Most citizens had never been inside a car, let alone imagined owning one. The nation was struggling to recover from depression, humiliation, and inflation. But in that emptiness, a promise could take root. And Adolf Hitler knew how to make promises sound like destiny. He stood before crowds and spoke of unity, renewal, and national pride. And among his grand visions for highways and armaments, he added one smaller, more personal vision: a car for every German family. It would not be a luxury, he said. It would be a birthright. To turn his vision into metal, he sought a designer who could make the impossible practical. That man was Ferdinand Porsche, brilliant, methodical, and already respected for his work on fast, efficient machines. Porsche was not a politician, though he worked easily with them. What drew him to the project was its challenge. The specifications were strict. A car that could carry 2 adults and 3 children, travel 100 kilometers per hour, sip fuel, and survive rough roads, all for under 1,000 Reichsmarks. It was a tall order, but Porsche's mind thrived on precision. He approached the project with the cool detachment of an engineer solving an equation. The design that emerged was compact, round, and practical. A shell of soft curves that seemed to move even while standing still. The engine sat in the rear, air-cooled and robust, chosen because it required no radiator or complex plumbing. The suspension was independent, the structure simple. Every part was designed to be cheap, strong, and easy to build. It wasn't a car meant to dazzle. It was a car meant to endure. When Hitler saw the prototype, he approved it immediately. It matched his ideals, small, disciplined, efficient, and it could be mass-produced by German hands. But beneath that efficiency lay something darker. The car was never just about mobility. It was about control. The Volkswagen, literally, the people's car, was to be a tool of national unity, an emblem of obedience. It would link the individual's pride to the state's purpose. The Führer would give the people their car. The people would give him their loyalty. The propaganda machine began almost as soon as the blueprints were finalized. Posters appeared showing happy families, sunlight glinting off polished hoods. Pamphlets promised that through small weekly payments, any German worker could own his very own Volkswagen, a reward for faith in the regime. Yet for all the posters and promises, not one citizen ever received a car. The money poured in through the savings scheme, but the vehicles never rolled off the line for private buyers. By the time the great Wolfsburg factory was completed, the world was preparing for war. The people's car became a soldier's tool. Production shifted overnight from family vehicles to military ones. Porsche's design proved too good to ignore. The same frame and engine that promised to carry families across the countryside could also carry troops across battlefields. Modified versions, the Kübelwagen and the amphibious Schwimmwagen, rolled into North Africa, Russia, and France. The Volkswagen dream had been weaponized. At Wolfsburg, the workers were no longer citizens saving for a future car. They were prisoners, conscripts, and forced laborers from across occupied Europe. Under Nazi oversight, they built engines and chassis for vehicles they would never drive, in a factory that had promised freedom but delivered servitude. The irony could not have been greater. The people's car, built by people stripped of their rights. Still, the design endured. The small, air-cooled engine that had once symbolized optimism now powered the war effort. Porsche himself turned increasingly toward military projects, including tanks. The factory became part of Germany's war machine, its chimneys smoking night and day. And then, When the war finally broke, the dream collapsed. By 1945, Wolfsburg was in ruins. The factory's roof had been torn open by bombs. The assembly lines were twisted metal. The fields around it were filled with wreckage. The car that was meant to unite a people had instead been buried beneath the ashes of a defeated nation. But that is never quite where history ends. Sometimes it pauses and waits for someone new to notice what remains. The war ended not with parades, but with silence. Germany was broken. Its cities flattened, its industries dismantled, its spirit hollowed out by defeat. Among the rubble lay the Volkswagen factory, scarred and gutted by years of bombardment. Its great assembly halls were open to the sky, its machines half buried in concrete dust. The dream of the people's car seemed finally dead. When British forces occupied that region of Germany, they found Wolfsburg as a ghost town, a place where the workers had fled or starved, and the only things left standing were twisted steel and half-finished chassis. The Allies could have torn it all down. Many factories were dismantled and shipped abroad as reparations. But one man looked at the ruins and saw something else. His name was Major Ivan Hirst, an officer in the British Army trained as an engineer. When he arrived in Wolfsburg in the summer of 1945, the factory was technically his responsibility, an administrative problem to be catalogued and possibly scrapped. But Hirst had an eye for potential. He discovered a few intact vehicles among the rubble, battered but recognizable. Beetle-shaped prototypes with round roofs and rear engines, gathering dust under broken rafters. He ordered one repaired. When the little car sputtered back to life, its air-cooled engine coughing out smoke but running, something remarkable happened. Amid the ruins of a lost empire, the Volkswagen still worked. Hirst saw what others had missed, that this simple, sturdy design could be exactly what the new Germany needed. A car without luxury, without ideology, built to move people from place to place in a country that had forgotten movement. He cleaned out the factory, salvaged machinery, and called back the German workers who had once assembled engines there. Under British authority, production resumed, not for propaganda this time, but for survival. At first, the cars were built for the occupying forces. The British Army needed light transport vehicles. But soon, word spread. The car was simple to repair, inexpensive to build, and surprisingly resilient. In 1946, Hirst received an order for 20,000 cars. That order saved Volkswagen. It gave the factory a reason to exist again, and gave its workers a kind of fragile dignity. The early post-war Beetles were rough. Mismatched panels, faded paint, engines rebuilt from scrap. Yet they ran. They ran on bad fuel, bad roads, and bad weather. And that was enough. Hirst, with his practical British humor, joked that the Beetle wasn't pretty, but it was honest. He was right. The car had no ideology left, no speeches attached to it, no banners hanging overhead. It was simply a machine that worked. And for a country trying to stand up again, that mattered more than any symbol. As the years passed, the British helped re-establish the factory structure. Management, quality control, supply chains. They appointed a German director, Heinrich Nordhoff, a man of industry and discipline who had worked at Opel before the war. Nordhoff understood what Hirst had started. He recognized that this car, this funny, round little machine once tied to the regime, could become something else entirely, something human, apolitical, and enduring. He began refining the design, improving reliability, tightening standards, and slowly building a reputation not for glamour, but for trust. Under Nordhoff's leadership, Volkswagen adopted a philosophy of quiet perfectionism. Every improvement was small, deliberate, and invisible to most buyers. Thicker metal here, better wiring there, smoother gear shifts, improved fuel economy. By the early 1950s, Germany's economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was taking shape. Factories reopened, cities were rebuilt, and once again people began to dream of mobility. And there, waiting for them, was the car that refused to die. The Volkswagen Beetle, no longer Hitler's people's car, but Germany's humble companion. It was now a symbol not of control, but of recovery, a small, round emblem of a nation's rebirth. In its simplicity lay its genius. The design that had been militarized now carried groceries, children, and hope. Its air-cooled engine, perfect for war zones, was just as perfect for mountain roads and crowded cities. It did not need luxury. It needed only to work, and in working, it earned affection. As the 1950s dawned, Volkswagen expanded production, exporting cars across Europe. The Beetle's reputation spread, a car that could survive the worst and still keep moving. It was reliable, efficient, and, in its round, cheerful form, oddly endearing. What had begun as a tool of propaganda had become a symbol of perseverance. The very same design that once served tyranny was now serving ordinary people. History, it seemed, had found a strange balance. The story of the Beetle was far from over. It would soon cross oceans and languages, taking on new meanings in places far from Wolfsburg. What had once been Hitler's car was about to become the world's car. And in doing so, it would rewrite its own past. By the mid-1950s, the scars of war were slowly fading. Germany was rebuilding, and so was its reputation. Factories that had once forged tanks were now producing typewriters, sewing machines, and small, unassuming cars with round fenders and smiling faces. The Volkswagen Beetle was one of them, perhaps the most unlikely ambassador for a country that had once tried to dominate the world. The British Army had stepped away. The plant was now entirely German-run. But its survival was no longer just a local triumph. It had become a quiet, industrial miracle. Every month, new ships left Hamburg carrying crates of Beetles bound for Europe, South America, Africa, and eventually the United States. It was not fast, it was not flashy, but it was dependable. And dependability, after a decade of chaos, was the rarest luxury of all. At first, the American market didn't know what to make of it. In a land of tail fins, chrome, and horsepower, the little Volkswagen looked almost comical. When the first Beetles arrived in the late 1940s, importers struggled to sell them. Dealers nicknamed it the pregnant roller skate. It was small, noisy, and utterly un-American in its modesty. But there was something honest about it. Something that, without trying, began to charm people. The Beetle's virtues were the ones Detroit had forgotten: economy, reliability, and character. It didn't rust easily. It started on cold mornings, and it had a kind of personality, a car that looked back at you, round and unpretentious, as if it didn't mind being underestimated. As the 1950s gave way to the early 1960s, Volkswagen's advertising agency in America, Doyle Dane Bernbach, took a bold approach. They didn't try to hide the car's oddness. They celebrated it. The famous campaign used humor and humility instead of bragging and glamour. Posters showed the Beetle surrounded by white space with a simple caption: "Think small." It was the first time a car company had dared to laugh at itself, and people loved it. The campaign resonated with a new generation that was growing tired of pretense and power. The Beetle, once born of propaganda, now succeeded through honesty. It became the car of school teachers, young couples, and anyone who didn't need to prove a point. By 1960, over 1 million Beetles were on the road, and by the mid-1960s it had transformed from a foreign curiosity into an icon of American culture. College students drove them cross-country. Artists painted flowers on their hoods. In an era of social change, the Beetle was the car that seemed to belong to everyone, and no one at once. It was cheap enough for the young, reliable enough for the working class, and friendly enough to bridge both. While the world was changing, civil rights marches, the Cold War, the space race, the Beetle remained unchanged. Its design hardly shifted at all. Year after year, its face stayed the same, as if to say, "You don't need to be new to be good." It was a strange irony. The car that had once been created to represent a totalitarian vision was now the emblem of independence and nonconformity. In California, it became a surfer's companion, easy to fix, easy to love. In New York, it was a practical commuter car. In Brazil and Mexico, it became a local product, built by workers who saw it not as a foreign design, but their own. The Beetle's shape, round, familiar, instantly recognizable, began to mean different things in different places. In Germany, it meant reliability. In America, it meant individuality. In Latin America, it meant opportunity. Its design had transcended its origin. The car had outgrown its creator. The Beetle had become, in every sense, the people's car, at last. Through the 1960s, production expanded at a staggering rate. Factories opened in Brazil, Australia, and South Africa. The car that began in a single factory under a regime of control was now being built on every continent by free hands. By 1968, Volkswagen was the largest car manufacturer in the world. And yet, even as success piled up, there was something humble in the company's identity. A quiet pride, born not of conquest, but of endurance. The Beetle had survived war, ruin, and ridicule, and had emerged as a global phenomenon. For millions, it represented the triumph of simplicity. For others, it was nostalgia on four wheels, a reminder that progress didn't always have to mean complexity. As the decade turned, however, change was on the horizon again. The very qualities that had made the Beetle so beloved, its smallness, its simplicity, its modest power, were beginning to feel outdated. New safety standards, emission laws, and consumer expectations were reshaping the automotive world. The Beetle, once ahead of its time, was in danger of being left behind. And yet, even as newer models arrived, something about the Beetle refused to fade. It had moved beyond fashion. It had become personal, a companion, a memory, a story in metal. But before the Beetle could become legend, it had to endure decline. And in that decline, it found its final transformation, from a car to a cultural icon. By the early 1970s, the world was changing faster than the Beetle could keep up. Highways stretched farther. Cars grew larger, faster, and more complex. And yet, amid the roar of progress, that small, round silhouette still moved quietly through city streets, patient, familiar, unbothered. For decades, the Beetle had been the face of Volkswagen's success. But even icons age. New rivals had arrived, more modern, more spacious, more efficient. Volkswagen itself began developing their replacement, a front-engine, water-cooled hatchback named the Golf. Inside Wolfsburg, engineers debated the Beetle's future. How do you retire a symbol? How do you tell millions of loyal drivers that the car they loved had reached the end of its evolution? But the truth was, the Beetle had given all it could. Its rounded form, once modern, was now nostalgic. Its air-cooled engine, once a marvel, was outdated. And yet, despite that, it continued to sell. In the 1970s, as the oil crisis shook the world, the Beetle suddenly made sense again. While larger cars lined up at fuel stations, the Beetle kept going, light, efficient, frugal. It was as if history had granted it one last encore, but time, as always, moved forward. Volkswagen officially ended production in Germany in 1978. The last Beetle rolled off the line at the Emden plant, its workers pausing in quiet applause. It wasn't a funeral. It was a farewell to an old friend. Still, the Beetle wasn't truly gone. Production continued abroad, in Mexico, Brazil, and Nigeria, where its simple mechanics and low cost kept it alive for decades more. In those countries, it was no relic. It was a workhorse. Taxi drivers in Mexico City swore by it. Farmers in Brazil relied on it. Students in Africa repaired them with tools no more sophisticated than a wrench and patience. Everywhere it went, it adapted. The Beetle had long outlived its creators. Hitler was dead. Porsche was gone. Nordhoff, too. But their unlikely collaboration, born of control, refined through survival, had taken on a new identity entirely. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Beetle had become something rare, a car with a soul. Collectors restored them, artists painted them, families passed them down through generations. The Beetle no longer belonged to any company or ideology. It belonged to memory itself. In film, it became a character. Herbie, the lovable racing Beetle, captured hearts around the world. In music, it appeared on album covers and in lyrics. It was a car that didn't just carry people, it carried feelings. Even as Volkswagen evolved, the Beetle's ghost lingered. When the company launched the Golf, the Passat, the Polo, each new generation of cars carried a trace of the Beetle's DNA: simplicity, reliability, and warmth. And yet people never stopped asking, when will the Beetle return? It did, twice. In 1998, Volkswagen unveiled the new Beetle, a modern reinterpretation of the original, rounder and sleeker, built not for necessity, but nostalgia. It was not quite the same. Its engine sat in the front. Its charm was deliberate. But the silhouette, that unmistakable curve, remained. For an older generation, it was a reminder of youth. For a younger one, it was something new that felt timeless. The new Beetle's launch reignited affection for the old one. Across continents, vintage Beetles were restored and celebrated. Enthusiasts gathered at rallies, sharing stories that began in scrapyards and workshops. Each car had its own tale: a summer road trip, a first date, a journey to the coast, stories of freedom, imperfection, and endurance. By the time the final Beetle rolled off the line in Puebla, Mexico in 2019, the world watched with quiet respect. 80 years had passed since Hitler had ordered the creation of the people's car, and there it was, ending not in tyranny, but in applause. The Beetle had outlived its purpose, outlived its makers, and outlived its past. It had survived not because it was perfect, but because it was loved. In every scratch, every sputtering engine, every faded seat, it carried the history of the 20th century. From the rubble of Wolfsburg to the freeways of California, its journey was not one of engineering alone, but of redemption. And that is perhaps the greatest irony of all. A car conceived in darkness became, over time, one of the world's most enduring symbols of lightness, of freedom, humor, and humanity. When the last Beetle was built in 2019, a small orchestra played inside the Puebla factory. Workers stood silently as the car rolled forward, its blue paint shining under the lights. It was not a product being finished. It was a life being remembered. 80 years earlier, the same shape had emerged under banners and speeches, promising a dream that was never delivered. Now it left the stage as a friend, its history rewritten by millions of ordinary people who had made it their own. In the end, the Beetle's story is not just about a car. It is about how meaning changes, how what begins in darkness can, through time and human use, become something else entirely. The people's car began as a propaganda tool, born from a regime that sought control over every aspect of life. Its early promise, mobility for all, was twisted by war, then abandoned in ruins. Yet from those same ruins, men like Ivan Hirst and Heinrich Nordhoff saw possibility where others saw waste. They, and the workers who rebuilt Wolfsburg from the ground up, transformed the Beetle from a symbol of control into a vehicle of renewal. Every nut and bolt reassembled in those years carried an unspoken message that even in the aftermath of destruction, ordinary craftsmanship can rebuild dignity. And perhaps that is why the Beetle lasted as long as it did, because it was never truly about efficiency or innovation. It was about persistence. Its air-cooled engine, noisy and stubborn, seemed to echo the endurance of those who kept it alive, mechanics, families, travelers, dreamers. Its curved body, shaped by an engineer's precision, became a kind of mirror, reflecting the world's changes decade after decade. In each era, people saw themselves in it. For the post-war generation, it meant work and recovery. For the 1960s, youth, it meant independence and rebellion. For collectors and nostalgics today, it means memory, a tangible link to a time when machines were simple, comprehensible, and personal. It is rare for an object of industry to outgrow its origins so completely. The Beetle did. It became not a reminder of where it came from, but of what humanity can make from what it inherits. As the 20th century faded, the Beetle remained, round, small, unthreatening, a quiet companion to the grand sweep of history. It outlasted the ideology that birthed it. It outlasted the Cold War, the oil crisis, and its own replacements. And through it all, it never changed much. It never needed to. In that constancy lies its poetry. The Beetle didn't chase progress. It endured it. While empires rose and fell, it kept going, slowly, cheerfully, and without complaint. It became, in its own quiet way, a teacher, a reminder that progress is not always about speed or power, but about continuity, about how something humble, made well, can outlast the noise of history. And when people look back on the 20th century, on its tragedies, its triumphs, its contradictions, they might find, tucked somewhere in the background of a photograph, a little car with round headlights and a gentle curve to its roof. It is there at parades, protests, weddings, and long-forgotten family trips. A witness more than a participant, a constant presence through eras of upheaval. Its story reminds us that history doesn't always move in straight lines. Sometimes it circles, round and imperfect, like the Beetle itself. And perhaps that is why it remains loved. Because the Beetle's true achievement was not its design or its longevity, but its transformation, from a project of control to a symbol of freedom. It is proof that even the most unlikely beginnings can be rewritten by time, by purpose, and by people. As the world now moves into the era of silence, of electric motors and digital dashboards, the Beetle belongs to another age, but its spirit lingers in every small, efficient, human-centered car that followed. Because in the end, the people's car really did belong to the people. Not the ones who conceived it, but the ones who drove it, loved it, and kept it alive. The Beetle was not the story of one man or one regime. It was the story of millions, and that, perhaps, is the legacy worth remembering. History often leaves us with contradictions. Objects that outlive their origins, inventions that defy their intent. The Volkswagen Beetle is one of them. Born in the shadow of tyranny, it found its meaning in the hands of ordinary people, and in doing so, it turned a nation's scar into a global smile. Its wheels may have stopped turning, but its story keeps rolling, quietly, endlessly through time.